Hi everyone, it's Joe. Welcome to today's lecture. This is lecture 5 for exam 3 for PC Neurobiology 2020 in our online format. Today we're going to look at a paper by Cirelli and colleagues. It's titled Reduced Sleep in Drosophila shaker mutants. We know that sleep is essential from the paper in the book on fatal familial insomnia. And this paper also looks at sleep deprivation. They say sleep occupies 1/3 of our life and an even larger proportion in infants. It is present in virtually every animal species where it has been studied, despite the danger of partial disconnection from the environment. Total sleep deprivation can be fatal, and even partial deprivation of sleep has serious consequences on cognitive, mood, and health. What they do in this paper is mutagenize Drosophila, which you guys know are fruit flies, and they look at 6,000 lines that were mutagenized by ethylmethane sulfonate, which is some chemical, obviously, that mutates the DNA. These are X chromosome mutations, they say. And they look through a collection of about 3,000 lines carrying randomly inserted P and EP transposable elements. So at any rate, I don't want to go through all of that. There are ways of causing mutations in the flies, one with a chemical and one with these transposable elements. And they create these mutations, and they look at about 9,000 different mutations, that is, sort of families of fruit flies, if you will, that have some sort of mutation that they've induced in those fly lines. They say in the paper, we identified 15 lines having a mean daily amount of sleep at least 2 standard deviations less than the average for both males and females. The EMS line E1174, one of the most extreme, was termed mini-sleep and designated for further study. They also say that the mini-sleep phenotype maps to the X chromosome and is recessive. They say that wild-type flies and heterozygous female mini-sleep flies sleep for 9 to 15 hours every day, but both male and heterozygous female mini-sleep flies sleep only 4 to 5 hours a day. They say that sleep is defined here, as in previous work, as behavioral immobility lasting 5 minutes or more, which is consistently associated with increased arousal thresholds during both light and dark periods. Okay, so what does all that mean? It means that they took these fruit flies and they mutated them somehow with chemicals or with these transposable elements, and then they developed these lines, family lines of flies, and they had to stare. Someone had to stare at the test tube of fruit flies to see whether they were immobile for 5 minutes at a time. And if they were immobile for 5 minutes, then they were considered asleep at that particular point. And they had to do that with 9,000 fly lines. So I don't know who did that work. It must have been, a set of graduate students or maybe some undergraduates, I don't know, but it's a lot of work, needless to say. Then they found different lines that had issues with sleep, and this particular line showed an X-linked recessive inheritance pattern. So let's take a look at figure 1, which is a pretty serious figure. They start just by showing you the different lines of flies in a graph, and they show on this side, on this axis, they show the number of fly lines, and here they show amount of sleep, and they show female and male for the different fly lines, and it just shows the amount of sleep each of the fly lines gets. So it turns out that if you look at the graph, it appears as though female flies of all of the lines that they looked at get about at the peak get about 700 minutes of sleep in a 24-hour cycle, and it looks like males sleep on average a little bit more, something like 800 minutes in a 24-hour cycle. And then they find a cell line down here and down here that they call mini sleep, MNS, they abbreviate it. And it turns out that in that particular fly line, the flies get in males, about 300 minutes of sleep in a 24-hour cycle, and females a little bit less, like, I don't know, 250. I didn't see any specific numbers in the paper. Maybe you'll find it. Okay, so the data just shows that the majority of fly lines get between 700 and 800 minutes of sleep a day, and in the mini sleep flies, they only get 250 to 300 minutes of sleep in a 24-hour cycle. Okay, so less sleep. So this is figure 1A, and then in figure 1B, they're looking at circadian rhythm, the day-night sleep cycle of flies. And they have two types. They have wild type that they term CS, and then they have mini sleep. And again, they look at females and males. So these are females and males. And it shows that flies sleep a little bit during the day, and then at night there's a kind of a big increase, and they sleep longer at night. And they say this starts at 8 a.m. and then it goes to midnight, and then from midnight it goes to 8 a.m. again. So if you look at males, the males again sleep a little bit more during the day, so they have a bigger peak during the day, and then they have also they also get a lot of sleep at night. If you look at the mini sleep, it turns out that of course they get less, but they follow a similar pattern like this, and same with males, something like this, whatever. And they just say that even though the mini sleep flies sleep less both during the day and at night, they still have a circadian rhythm. They don't think that the circadian rhythm is interrupted by this particular mutation. Okay, guys, I'm sorry I made a mistake. This is not midnight. This is 8 p.m. They used a military clock and they said 20 hours, and that threw me off. So from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and then from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. The next figure is arousal threshold, which is figure C, and all they're doing is basically saying what happens if you poke the sleeping fly. That's my interpretation. They say number responses as a percent, and this is the control, which is CS, and then mini sleep, MNS, sorry, and then this is after the control, or the wild type rather, has been asleep for 1 minute. This is when it's been asleep for 5 minutes, 1 minute, and 5 minutes. And the point of the matter is, if you poke the fly, then you get a pretty high level of response, which is, it looks like to be about 90% if you look at the graph. And it's the same, more or less the same in the mini sleep fly. So whether it's a wild type fly or it's a mini sleep fly, whether it's been sleeping for 1 minute or 5 minutes, when you poke it, it wakes up. That's the result. That's the result of that experiment. Okay, stay with me, guys. We're getting there. This is the most important figure of the paper, which is figure. Is figure D, and they're looking at either the number of times the flies sleep in a 24-hour period, so they call that episodes, the number of episodes that the flies are sleeping, and duration. And the first part of the figure is, they have it divided like this, and they say this is number of episodes. And if you look at the wild type in mini sleep, the number of episodes are about the same. I mean, it's a little bit more in mini sleep, but it's not statistically significant. Then, if you look at the duration of sleep when they're asleep, then there's a huge difference between wild type and mini sleep flies. So the second part of the figure just talks about waking episodes. And obviously, if your sleeping episodes are shorter in duration, then your waking episodes must be longer. So they show that in the second figure, but their second part of that figure. So all of the data so far boils down to the fact that mini sleep flies, of course, sleep less than normal flies, than wild type flies. But they still have a circadian rhythm. They still respond to stimulus. It looks like the number of times they fall asleep during the day, the number of episodes is the same as wild type, but it turns out when they fall asleep, they stay asleep for a shorter duration. So that's the phenomena that's exhibited. So I just can't imagine how much time it took to stare at these 9,000 different fly lines to figure out if they're asleep or not asleep. They have to look at them over a 24-hour cycle and figure out whether poking them wakes them up and so on. But at any rate, they say in the paper, while performing the behavioral characterization of mini sleep flies, we notice they exhibit a transient shaking of the legs and scissoring of the wings when recovering from diethyl ether anesthesia. 4 genes on the X chromosome, when mutated, can result in a shaking phenotype: shaker, etheragogo, hyperkinetic, and shaking B. The shaking phenotype of mini sleep flies was dominant, persisted in amputated legs, and was not seen when intact flies were exposed to chloroform, halothane, isoflurane, or enflurane, suggesting strongly a mutation of the shaker locus. Okay, so that's all based on past research. What they're saying is that it had been previously shown that there are 4 different mutations on the X chromosome that have this shaking phenotype. And apparently if you expose the shaker fly lines or the mini sleep fly lines to these different chemicals, they stop shaking, suggesting that the mutation in shaker and the mutation in mini sleep might be the same mutation or a mutation in the same gene. So by positional cloning, they determine that the location of the shaker mutation and the location of the mini sleep mutation is on the same region of chromosome X. And they sequence that region and they figure out that the shaker locus encodes the alpha subunit of a tetrameric voltage-dependent potassium channel that controls membrane repolarization after action potentials and presynaptic transmitter release. So, the protein that's mutated is a potassium channel that's, guess what, in the membrane of neurons involved in neuronal action potentials. They then are able to take a wild type copy of that gene and insert it into the genome of Drosophila, and since the disease is X-linked recessive, when they insert one good copy into the fly and express it, that saves the flies and they no longer shake. So I really like this paper, but the one question that comes to mind when I read it is whether this mutation has anything to do with sleep at all. I mean, it looks like it has to do with shaking. And of course, this flies sleep less, but maybe they're just being shaken awake. And so it's a symptom of some other physiological phenomena, the shaking. Okay, you guys, that's it. A short one for today. I hope you guys have a good weekend. 1 week left. Talk to you next week.